I ngā manu o ngā wao tapu o te motu, ngā mihi o te wā kia koutou katoa. Nau mai, hara mai ki tēnei webinar tuarua o te manatū mo te taiao. Ko Whitney Nuku tōku ingoa, and I'm a senior analyst in the policy implementation team at Te Manatū mo te taiao. We are very grateful to have you all here with us today. I ngā manu o ngā wao tapu o te motu, ngā mihi o te wā kia koutou katoa. Nau mai, hara mai ki tēnei webinar tuarua o te manatū mo te taiao. Ko Whitney Nuku tōku ingoa. And a little bit of a tech, my tech twin. Let's try that again. Ngā mihi o te wā kia koutou. Nau mai, hara mai ki tēnei webinar tuarua. We are very grateful to have you all with us today. Nei rā te mihi nui kia koutou. To open this session, as we may have new members of our audience today, we'd like to start with a word of welcome from our Deputy Secretary, Martin Workman. Mā taki mai.
Kia ora, I'm Martin Workman, the Deputy Secretary for Sustainable Land Use at the Ministry for the Environment. Welcome to this webinar. You all have a role to play as we work together to achieve Te Mana o Te Wai. We're at an important point as we move from developing new national direction to implementation. Because every catchment and water body is different, there is no simple solution, but we are committed to working with everyone with an interest as we move forward. So thank you for participating. We all have the same goals to protect and restore our fresh water. I know you have a lot of questions and I hope this webinar will answer them for you. Thank you for making the time to join this webinar today.
Nau mai hoki mai, welcome back. Today's webinar is part one of continuous farm practice improvement through the National Environmental Standards for Freshwater and the Section 360 regulations. We'll be providing an overview of the new regulations related to intensive winter grazing, stock holding, and stock exclusion. Please let me introduce our panel of presenters today. A mighty MFE duo, Brian Smith and Henrietta Ansell. Both members of the Sustainable Land Use Delivery Division, or SLUD as we call ourselves. Brian is the Chief Advisor of the division and Henrietta is an analyst in the Policy Implementation team. Tēnā kōrua, thank you for being with us today. Before we kick off, I just need to share a few housekeeping details. So there's no live Q&A. We asked for your questions to be sent beforehand when you register. So if you've submitted a pātai, we've got it, and we'll try to answer them through this webinar content. For other more technical or legal focused questions, there is guidance coming that should respond directly to those. But please keep in mind, e te iwi, there are some questions we're not able to answer. As you probably know, questions that might require us giving a legal interpretation of the policy. In saying that, we do want to hear from you and we will do our best to provide the support you need. So please continue to engage with us throughout these webinars and keep an eye out for the upcoming guidance documents. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. So if you do want to send it to your networks, a YouTube link of the live recording will be made available on the Ministry for the Environment YouTube channel. Hei aha, to start us off and to get us into the right frame of mind, please watch this short clip to remind us why we are all here today, the importance of giving effect to Te Mana o Te Wai in order to sustain life. After which I'll pass the time to our panelist, Brian Smith. Tēnā rā koutou katoa.
Kei te tangi a Ranginui, kei te tangi a Papatōnuku, kei te rere a Rau a Roimata, e rere ana ki tai, a rere ana ki uta. whakarongo mai, whakarongo mai, whakarongo mai. Kei hea ngā kaitiaki o te mana o te wai. Hei oranga wairua, hei oranga tangata, hei oranga mo te katoa o Aotearoa.
Brian, the time is yours.
Thank you, Whitney, and thanks for that introduction. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you all here. Right, that's a great way to segue into the first of the topics that I'm going to cover today, which is the topic of Te Mana o Te Wai. Te Mana o Te Wai started as an acknowledgement of the concept in the 2014 National Policy Statement, which evolved into a requirement for councils to consider and recognise Te Mana o Te Wai in the 2017 version of the National Policy Statement. It was an area of intense interest to the Kāhui Waimāori, and they were very keen and recommended strongly that the government agree, or the minister agree, to move to make that acknowledgement and turn it into a requirement to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. And I think it's illustrative of the development of the way New Zealanders collectively think about water these days, that the government did indeed propose to make that a give effect to requirement. And it got very strong support throughout the consultation process. There was virtually unanimous support for the concept of a mandatory requirement to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. Te Mana o Te Wai, of course, is a Māori concept coming from the Māori world, but it increasingly reflects how all New Zealanders think about the water and the water that's closest to them, and what they want for the water that's closest to them. I guess the most obvious expression of Te Mana o Te Wai in the new National Policy Statement is the requirement for councils to apply the hierarchy of interests when they make plans and make decisions under those plans. So those obligations, or the hierarchy of interests, the first obligation goes to the water. The water needs to be put first, and its health and mauri needs to be protected and enhanced. Only after that's done can the second obligation be met, which is to provide for the essential needs of people, such as drinking water. And only after those two obligations are met can the third obligation be looked into and provided for, and that's to provide for all the other things we do with water for our economic well-being and recreational uses, etc. There's been quite a bit of talk about what exactly that means in terms of the priorities. What it doesn't mean is that there's a requirement to provide a pristine state. Clearly, when you look at the overall National Policy Statement, the National Outcomes Framework, there's a clear recognition that people affect water and that people need to provide for their well-being and their needs. But the point being that only happens after the mauri of the water has been protected and enhanced, and that there's an intrinsic value to doing that. The second key part of it is the principles. There's a set of principles applying to tangata whenua and a set of principles applying to the rest of New Zealand, and they're very similar and they mirror each other. The first principle is the principle of mana whakahaere. That's the ability and the right of Māori to express decision making and have authority. The second is kaitiakitanga, which I think most people in New Zealand know and understand as the stewardship, the principle of stewardship. But also in terms of Māori, it's a principle it's an obligation of stewardship. And then the third principle is mana kiakitanga, which is the principle of generosity and care and respect. Those are mirrored for the rest of New Zealand in the principles of governance, stewardship, and care and respect. Can I have the next slide, please? So councils have to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, but the National Policy Statement lays out some pretty specific obligations and requirements to do that. And there really are 5 key pillars to giving effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. The first is a strengthened requirement to involve tangata whenua in the freshwater management process and in the decision-making process. Now, there was a lot of talk about the sharing of decision-making authority. That's not possible at this stage under the Resource Management Act, so councils retain their ultimate decision-making authority. But the requirements to engage and to actively engage tangata whenua are stronger than in the previous national policy statement. That also means councils have an obligation to enable tangata whenua to participate in these processes in a full and comprehensive way. The second key element is that councils need to bring together a series of values and knowledge systems that go beyond just traditional Western science. Traditional Western science, of course, is incredibly valuable and very important, but equally now there's an obligation to bring knowledge and value systems such as Mataranga Māori to the decision-making process and enable that to happen. The third key obligation is to apply those hierarchy of obligations I talked about before when developing freshwater management plans and implementing the national objectives framework. Fourth, that councils now need to engage with tangata whenua and their communities to set long-term visions for their water bodies. Now, this is a new requirement. We kind of modelled it on on what's happened in the Waikato through the joint process that's operated there with Māori. And this is the idea that there's an intergenerational challenge for us here, that not all of this can be resolved in one go in 10 years, 20 years, or even 30 years potentially. But it's very important to lay out a future and a pathway that achieves Te Mana o Te Wai ultimately, even if that takes many decades to achieve. And then those milestones along the way need to be reported against. And the fifth cornerstone here is that it's important, it's necessary to take a holistic view from mountain to sea, including the receiving environments, estuarine environments, etc., and even the coastal environment to the extent that that is affected by freshwater management. So it's a requirement to take a comprehensive view. Now, in many ways, of course, many councils are moving in this direction anyway, but this codifies that and makes that a mandatory requirement. There is a sixth requirement, and that is that councils must work with their tangata whenua to consider the use of some of the decision sharing options that are available under the Resource Management Act. So that's an additional requirement in addition to those 5. All right, next slide, please. So when the government started this process, it had 3 key objectives in mind. You've probably heard us talk about this. They were the kind of bedrock of the consultation process that happened in September last year. The first was to stop further degradation of our waterways. And there are a bunch of regulations and requirements that take effect immediately that are designed to do that. They include things like the requirements or the limitations on intensification of land use. For example, the prevention of further loss of wetland and the protection from further loss of streams. The second area was to show material improvements within 5 years. And there's a series of instruments and measures to achieve that. For example, stock exclusion regulations, the intensive winter grazing regulations. And of course, the government has made available something in the order of $500 million for freshwater restoration protection activity through the Jobs for Nature Fund. And then the third key objective the government was to reverse past damage within a generation so that all of our waterways are in a healthy state. We were asked to define what a generation was. We didn't in the end, but it gives the idea that the times aren't unlimited here, that we need to take firm action and we need to move, but it also recognises that some of these things will take a generation to restore. Achieving this one, of course, that's the first objective of the national policy statement, and the changes that the government has made in terms of the process by which plans are made using independent panels and the like. Thanks. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about stock exclusion now, and there was a bunch of questions that were emailed in prior to this webinar, which I'll go through, and that'll hopefully elaborate a few more of the kind of interesting elements to the stock exclusion regulations. First, as a bit of background, the stock exclusion regulations, they didn't come out of the blue. The previous government had developed a series of stock exclusion regulations and was close to making those, but for various reasons they didn't. Stock exclusion regulations also, of course, were developed or proposed by the Land and Water Forum. So they've been on the cards for a number of years. These stock exclusion regulations apply to dairy cattle, beef cattle, pigs and deer. Importantly, they don't apply to sheep. They apply to natural wetlands, rivers and, lakes and rivers of more than 1 metre wide. Now that is 1 metre wide of the river bed, not 1 metre wide of the water body or the water as it happens to be at the time. And it's 1 metre wide at any point in the land parcel. They don't apply to drains and smaller streams. They don't apply to ephemeral streams, being temporary streams that run only very briefly after heavy rain. Some of those other items, such as drains, will ultimately be picked up in freshwater farm plans when those freshwater farm plans are developed and become available. So it's not that we are ignoring smaller rivers and streams. They are actually important sources of contamination, but that to develop a national set of regulation proved impossible for those, and it was much more sensible to leave that to a bespoke farm plan regime. Quite a bit of controversy about the issue of setbacks. We originally proposed an average 5 metre setback. For various reasons during the consultation process, that's morphed and become a minimum 3 metre setback from the bed, so that's the edge, of a lake or river. As of September this year, all new pastoral systems must follow the stock exclusion regulations immediately. From 1 July 2023, all dairy cattle and pigs need to be excluded from rivers, lakes and some wetlands, and that is regardless of the terrain. From 1 July 2025, all dairy support cattle, beef cattle and deer need to be excluded. But in terms of beef cattle and deer, that's on low slope land only. Okay, so dairy support cattle, all dairy cattle essentially have to be excluded no matter what the terrain. Beef cattle and deer need to be excluded on low slope land only. Now, there's been a bit of talk about the low slope maps, and we are engaged in a process to look at the low slope maps. In particular, you may be aware that the way that the mapping was done looked at the average average slope in a land parcel, and where that was 10 degrees or less, we picked that up in the low slope map. Now, what that's meant is that we've actually picked up some anomalies in there of some quite steep land, which wasn't the original intent of the policy, and ministers have asked us to have a look at that. We expect to have a look at that within probably the next 5 months at the most, to have some kind of resolution before ministers for their consideration. Ministers have also asked us to have a look at how the low slope maps pick up some extensive pastoral systems, where you might have 1 or 2 cows or cattle beast per hectare, and whether or not it's appropriate to pick those up in the low slope map. I would say that no matter what happens, if areas that are not within the low slope map, we still expect there will be a degree of stock exclusion required, but it will be via the farm planning regime rather than via these particular regulations. Next slide, please. Oh, this is just a few images. It's always good to have a few pickies. So the one on the top right shows a stock exclusion regime where clearly it's outside, or the fence is within the 3 metre stock exclusion area. That looks like a permanent fence. It's got driven posts and 2 electric wires by the look of it, and that meets the test of a permanent fence. Where you meet that test, you don't need to move the fence even if you are breaching the 3 metre setback. And then the one on the top right is a pretty good indication of the kind of damage that stock can do when they get into a riverbank and start chopping up that riverbank and causing sedimentation, as well as obviously direct contamination to the waterway. All right, next slide. So some questions that came through. Question 1, is 360 stock exclusion, is it reported required of a freshwater farm plan? Apart from the grammar of that, the short answer to that is yes. The way freshwater farm plans work in law is the farm planner and the farmer need to identify the risks associated with the farming activity that may affect water and freshwater ecosystems. And then they need to mitigate those risks and identify a series of requirements or actions that mitigate those risks. But the farm plan also must be consistent with any national regulation or council plans. So that's this is all laid out in section 217F. And the requirement to meet the requirements of national regulation or council plan or a resource consent for that matter, where those requirements are stricter than what would otherwise be done under the farm plan, they become part of the farm plan essentially. So yes, section 360 regulations will become part of the farm plan, unless of course the council chooses to put in tougher restrictions, such as a wider setback, for example, in which case that wider setback will take precedent. We are still working up exactly how that works, and we're talking with regional councils and industry and NGOs and Māori about exactly how that is all going to come together. So that process is ongoing. We want to do it at pace because we recognise that the freshwater farm plans are a pretty important part of the future regime. Second question, when does a grassed gully become the bed of a river? Well, we're not making any new law here. So the definition of a river and its bed are the same as in the current legislation. The definition of the bed of a river is that area of a river where the river or the stream will flow without breaking its banks at maximum flow. So you can imagine what that looks like. What that does mean is that if there isn't maximum flow a lot, there may well be some quite significant grassed areas between the banks. It's the bank of the river or the width of the bed, the edge of the bed, that is the determining factor for when you have to have your 3 metre setback. I know there's been some challenges and issues about that, particularly in Canterbury when we start talking about braided rivers, but we are following existing law. Next question, is there a potential to use farm scale mapping if it's available in lieu of the low slope maps? The short answer to that is no. We are looking at how the low slope map works, as I said before, but at this stage, there's no proposal to use an alternative farm scale mapping to achieve that. One of the reasons why we went to the low slope map was because one of the challenges for the first lot of proposed regulations was exactly when and where do they apply and how do you measure slope. The idea of the low slope map was to remove that from the equation, and really it's whether or not the land is mapped as low slope land that becomes the determinant as to whether or not stock exclusion is required. So it simplified that whole process, albeit we need to have another wee look at the low slope map and how it's working at the moment. The next question is what support is available for farmers to assist with transition? There is quite a lot of support out there at the moment. There's the $500 million odd in the Jobs for Nature package that the Ministry for the Environment is leading. There is money under the Billion Trees, and that can be used for planting and retiring of land or space planting. The Provincial Growth Fund, they've made something like 50 odd million available for planting and stock exclusion. And of course, there's the councils that we've been working through, and they've got their own funding streams, and to some extent, Jobs for Nature funding has been made available to councils. You may be aware that in the Kaipara, for example, the government's put 100 million towards, I think that's the 6-year program to make major improvement to the Kaipara Harbour, which is a critical receiving environment and is suffering from excessive sedimentation. How can you ascertain when a fence was built? Now, this question is in respect of whether or not you need to move your fence back. And the onus here really is on the landowner to show that the fence was in place prior to the regulations being made, and therefore that they don't need to move the fence back. I think it would be sensible for farmers to document when and where they planted their fences, and when they built their fences, and that will help provide an evidence base in case somebody asks them to move their fence. Once we get the farm plans up and running, I expect all of that will be documented as part of the farm planning regime. So we'll have a good documentation of that as those farm plans get rolled out. Do we need to fence riparian laneways for beef cattle, in particular, where it is not practical to put up a fence? This raises a good point, and that is that there is no requirement to fence. There's simply a requirement to keep stock 3 meters away from lakes, rivers, and some wetlands. And that means, for example, you might use an electric fence. You might elect not to put cattle or deer or pigs in a particular paddock. I know that's difficult sometimes, particularly on flats when you get a lot of pasture growth. So, alternatives such as electric or temporary fencing is probably the best way to go. If the stock are naturally excluded anyway, for example, there's a bluff, then there's no requirement to put up a fence. How do you manage fencing off of a stream in the event of flood removing the fence? Well, this is a very similar question to the one above, and the answer is very similar. That is, if the farmer wants to put in a permanent fence and there is a moving, highly mobile bed of the river, they'll need to locate that very carefully. But probably in most instances, the solution is more like a temporary fencing solution, such as electric. Next slide. We're nearly there. Questions continue. Is it permitted if a mob of cows only crosses a river twice per month, once to the yards, once back from the yards? This question is in respect of, I understand, a hill country environment or high, low intensity pastoral system in the high country. But it raises 2 points. Firstly, as I said before, we are looking at how the low slope map relates to high country or low intensity agricultural uses right now. So that's one part of the question. The other part of the question is, let's say we had 300 cattle. Can those 300 cattle cross the river once and then back again? Or if they do it more than that, do you need to put a bridge in place? So this comes under the stock exclusion regulation requirement that if you're going to move your cattle a lot across a river or stream, you need to put a bridge in place. And the threshold is twice per month. The question is, if can you move all the cattle mob once and back again, or can you move them in mobs of, say, 3 lots of 100, if you've got 300 cattle? We don't have the answer to that just at the moment, and we're going to give some more thought to that. We'll be developing some guidance around that issue, and we'll see where we get to in terms of the legal position as well. So watch this space on that question. Next question: what might the certified freshwater farm plan look like in terms of content? Well, as I've alluded to, you need to identify under the farm plan your risks of your farming practice to freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. And then you need to develop actions or requirements that mitigate, manage, or reduce those risks. That forms the basis of the content, plus anything that's required that's more strict than that from the regional council rules, a resource consent, or national direction. Exactly what that looks like, we're still working on, but it will include things like expectations around stock exclusion for areas that aren't otherwise covered by the stock exclusion regulations. Will the national policy statement, that should be the NES freshwater, I think, ban development of much wet farmland? So the issue here is the controls are on natural wetlands by and large, and if it's a natural wetland, then there are very strict limits on what you can do in and around the natural wetland, including prohibiting the destruction of natural wetlands unless it's for nationally significant or regionally significant infrastructure. So the rules are very tight, and it is true that it will prevent development of wetlands, natural wetlands. Natural wetlands, however, don't include wet parts of paddocks where you've got pasture already, some degree of pasture already. So you need to read both the definition in the RMA, which talks about sustaining natural ecosystems of plants adapted to wet environments from memory, as well as the definition that supplements that in the National Policy Statement and NES regulations. Okay, that's a lot. I hope that was useful. I'm going to hand over to Henrietta now, I think.
Kia ora, I'm Henrietta, and I'm going to talk you through some of the NES regulations. So NES is rules to protect the wetlands from draining, earthworks and vegetation clearance, restrictions on reclaiming rivers, rules to enable fish passage, rules for high-risk farming activities such as intensive winter grazing, feedlots, stock holding areas, and high-risk land use change. So today I'm going to talk to you about intensive winter grazing, feedlots, and stock holding areas. Next slide. Okay, so intensive winter grazing. Intensive winter grazing is defined as a grazing livestock on annual forage crop at any time in the period that begins on the 1st of May and ends with the close of the 30th of September of the same year. It is a permitted activity if it is no greater than 50 hectares or 10% of the area of the farm. There's also conditions, including pugging depth, land slope, and setback from waterways. And I'll go into these in the next slide. So in regards to timing, farmers will need to apply for a resource consent by October 2021 for the 2022 season, as long as they follow the conditions under section 20A in the RMA. These conditions are, sorry, back a slide. Cool. The conditions are that the farmer were permitted or allowed to without consent and lawfully established prior to the relevant regulations commencing. The effects of the activities are of the same or similar character, scale, and intensity as they were before commencement. The person carrying out the activities applies for consent no later than 6 months after the commencement, and the activities may continue until the consent application and any appeals are finally determined. So for the 2021 winter grazing season, this means that intensive winter grazing can continue without consent indefinitely if they're carried out in accordance with the permitted activity standards that I will mention in the next slide, or intensive winter grazing that cannot meet the permitted activity standards can also continue without a consent temporarily if the conditions in section 20A of the RMA are met. Cool, next slide. Okay, so the conditions. In regards to slope, the mean slope of a paddock that is used for intensive winter grazing, it has to be 10 degrees or less. We've chosen 10 degrees because we found with research at 15 degrees, the amount of sediment loss into waterways is actually double that at 10 degrees, and at 20 degrees, it's actually triple. In regards to pugging, at any one point, must not be deeper than 20 centimeters and must not cover more than 50% of the area. Our pugging is defined as a hoof print that penetrates below 5 centimeters. So from 5 centimeters onward, that's considered pugging. Livestock must be kept at least 5 meters away from the bed of any river, lake, wetland, and drain. And in regards to resow, paddocks must be replanted as soon as practical, no later than the 1st of October. But for Southland and Otago, this is no later than the 1st of November. And this is so we can avoid bare ground. Slide 3. Cool, so this is a bit of a shock value photo, and this is just to show the animal welfare issues and the real issues around pugging. We're definitely well aware that this is not common practice, but this is as bad as it can get. And so this is why it's something that we really need to reduce. Next slide. Okay, so a few questions that we have received. First one being, why have these re-sowing dates? So the re-sowing date under the intensive winter grazing policy was to include the regulations to address the risk to fresh water from leaving ground without vegetative cover for an extended period of time. As you know, leaving ground bare increases the chance that sediment and nutrients enter waterways, particularly during those really rainfally months. Research has shown that sediment loads for intensive winter grazing increase markedly past the 20% bare ground threshold. So the backstop date of the 1st of October provides regulatory certainty and balances the risk of high environmental impact of ground being left bare for months against uncertainty about pasture growth cycles. This was extended to the 1st of November for the colder Southland and Taiga regions as a direct result of the exposure draft in the NES regulations. So the next question, will there be guidance on slope? Yes, there will be. So MFE and MPI have been working together to create some develop some easy on the ground methodology for both farmers and for regional councils. Farmers so they can go out and determine slope before they select their paddock for intensive winter grazing, and for councils so they can go out and monitor and make sure that everyone's applying the regulations. Cool. And next question, how do you work out how much of the paddock is covered by pugging? So many industry groups such as Dairy NZ have readily available procedures to estimate pugging damage, so area of pug soil and depth of pugging, and to develop a plan of action to manage these pug soils. These pugged areas can be determined, for example, by taking several randomized measurements of the pug soil and estimating a proportion of the paddock that is pugged based on the area. However, this is only one method and will require specific guidance and material to assist farmers to determine the percentage of pugged land which is defensible. And this is something that we'll include in good management practice guidance coming in the future. Final question, we've got, how have you handled the reaction from the public over intensive winter grazing? So the government continues to work with the sector and the councils to make the intensive winter grazing rules practical, and also making sure that our implementation supports farmers and councils during this process. So the next couple of questions I can't answer right now, but they will be answered in guidance coming out in the future and will be considered for that guidance. Next slide. Cool. So we're on to stock holding and feedlots. So feedlots will require resource consent from the 3rd of September 2020. So feedlots already require resource consent as long as they comply to the standards that I'll go into soon. Stock holding areas are considered a permitted activity if minimum standards are met. If they are not, the landowner must apply for a resource consent from the 1st of July 2021. So stock holding areas include feed pads, winter pads, standoff pads, and loafing pads. Areas such as wintering barns, sacrifice paddocks, stockyards, or milking sheds are not captured by these regulations. Furthermore, these regulations do not apply for calves or calf sheds. So this means 90% or more of the cattle are held for no more than 4 months old or weigh no more than 120 kilograms. And that is also for feedlots. So the minimum requirements for stock holding to be considered a permitted activity, so without resource consent, is that the base of the feedlots must be sealed to a minimum permeability standard of 10 to the minus 9. If effluent expelled in the feedlot must be collected, stored, and disposed of in accordance with the rule in a regional or district plan or resource consent. And the feedlot stockholding area must be at least 50 metres away from any water body and water abstraction bore, drain, and coastal marine area. So those regulations must be met to be a permitted activity for stock holding areas, but for feedlots, they must be met to be a discretionary activity. So they must be met in order to get resource consent. Cool. Next slide. So we've just got 2 questions for this one. The first one is, will there be guidance on permittability? Yes. The website will be updated with questions that come in regularly, and therefore questions like these will come in, and then we'll produce an answer for them. And I know that this one will be coming up soon. Okay, so why did we use a minimum standard instead of a maximum when setting the permeability standards? So the use of the language minimum and a standard such as this is a little difficult to understand at first. It is important to note that the standard should be read as 10 to the negative 9, not 10 minus 9. So your permeability could be at 10 to the minus 10, but not 10 to the minus 8. This should be thought of as a minimum standard as opposed to a minimum number. What it's essentially saying is that the bare minimum, the feedlot sealing layer must be impermeable and not let any water into it. And that is all from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Ngā mihi nui ki tō tātou panel o tira kia koutou hoki e mātaki mai ana. Thank you again to our panel, Brian Smith and Henrietta Ansell, tēnā kōrua. To everyone online, thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar of this series. We hope you found it useful. If you've had any more pātai arise after this session, you can email us on freshwater@mfe.govt.nz. But just to remind you and reassure you, we've got technical guidance documents coming that will address the more technical questions you've raised. So thank you for taking the time to send these to us. But please stay tuned to this webinar series, as different types of guidance will be talked about in the upcoming webinars. Also, just so you know, you will receive a feedback form shortly, and we'd be very grateful if you could complete that for us. It's just an easy, anonymous form, click and it's sent. Should only take you about 4 minutes. Tērā wiki, our next webinar is same time, same place, next Wednesday, and we'll be talking about wetlands, rivers, and fish passage, and raising the bar on ecosystem health. Until next time, e te iwi, nei rā te mihi nui kia koutou katoa, nō reira, whatu ngaro ngaro te tangata, toitu te whenua. Kia ora hui hui mai anō tātou. Tēnā rā koutou katoa.